Hey Detoxers, welcome to a special episode of the Disinfo Detox. Given the news that yet another major news outlet, CBS, has settled for $16 million with Donald Trump, I wanted to investigate what, if anything, was actually illegal about what CBS supposedly did. To help us unpack this, I'm joined by Elizabeth Blakey. Elizabeth Blakey is a cultural sociologist, a California lawyer, and a professor in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication at California State University Northridge. Her research focuses on freedom of expression and digital media. She earned a Ph.D. in sociology from the University of Notre Dame and a J.D. from Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. All right, Professor Elizabeth Blakey, welcome to the Disinfo Detox.
Thanks for having me.
For those who don't remember, Trump accused CBS of editing an interview with then Vice President candidate Kamala Harris on its 60 Minutes program. Here's the clip that aired.
The work that we do diplomatically with the leadership of Israel is an ongoing pursuit around making clear our principles.
Here's an edited clip.
Well, let's start with this. On this subject, the aid that we have given Israel, allowed Israel to defend itself against 200 ballistic missiles that were just meant to attack the Israelis and the people of Israel. And I think that is the most recent example of why what we do to assist in their defense around military aid is important. And when we think about the threat that Hamas, Hezbollah presents, Iran, I think that it is without any question our imperative to do what we can to allow Israel to defend itself against those kinds of attacks. Now, the work that we do diplomatically with the leadership of Israel is an ongoing pursuit around making clear our principles, which include the need for humanitarian aid, the need for this war to end, the need for a deal to be done which would release the hostages and create a ceasefire.
Here's another clip that aired on CBS.
We're not going to stop pursuing what is necessary for the United States to be clear about where we stand on the need for this war to end.
Here's the unedited version of that clip.
The work that we have done has resulted in a number of movements in that region by Israel that were very much prompted by or a result of many things, including our advocacy for what needs to happen in the region. And we're not going to stop doing that. We're not going to stop pursuing what is necessary for the United States to be clear about where we stand on the need for this war to end.
Trump sued over the ways in which these clips were edited. At the time, CBS parent company Paramount needed government approval for a merger and reportedly considered settling with Trump. This led to the resignations of longtime producer Bill Owens and Wendy McMahon, both of CBS. Then yesterday it was announced that CBS would give Trump $16 million to his presidential library fund, which some are calling a bribe to secure approval for the merger. This has been a case that we've followed with great interest. And there's just a couple of questions I want to throw at you here. I know this is a weird place to start with someone with your accomplishments, but I was really struck by the conversation that took place about a week ago on the Joe Rogan Experience, where Joe Rogan and Senator Bernie Sanders got in somewhat of a disagreement over whether or not Trump's lawsuits against the media constituted intimidation and censorship.
Authority that Congress has.
When you say suing media, are you talking about the CBS lawsuit?
Among other things. He has,
right, but don't you think there's a real issue with what they did?
No. In this sense,
you don't think that there's a real issue in editing conversations to give someone an answer that's different than what they really answered?
Joe, I've been on 8 zillion shows, right? In my life.
Okay.
Now, should I sue you if you ask me some stupid question that I don't like, right? Or that you do something. Do I have a right? Should I sue you?
Yeah, but that's not what he's getting.
Well, he has
sued.
He has sued ABC.
Mm-hmm.
He has sued Meta. He is suing the Des Moines Register because of a poll that came out during the campaign that he didn't like.
And they really focused on this CBS case. And it seemed, at least from my perspective, that Rogan kept saying that CBS needs to be held accountable. And Bernie Sanders sort of argued that, well, it's unethical or it's problematic, but it doesn't rise to the level of something that's illegal. So what do you say to that? What was your take on this? Is what CBS did or is accused of doing illegal under any statute or law that you know of?
I would say that it's not illegal. There's often been, splicing of questions and answers in broadcasting, and through the years, that has not been found to be illegal under any statute or law. You have to kind of put laws in a hierarchy, and obviously the First Amendment is the highest of those, and it tries to separate the government from controlling news media judgment, and having a say in what counts as the official truth. So that's really the most important law that applies. But there is no statute or rule regulation of the FCC that gives them the power to control what's called news distortion. There is a policy about that has been around for about 80 years. But in prior cases, also including CBS documentaries and CBS 60 Minutes, the courts and the commission have not found that CBS committed news distortion when they splice together questions and answers in an interview, as long as it's still basically the truth.
Can you describe what constitutes news distortion, and then when, if ever, could a news broadcast do something illegal in terms of editing?
Okay, so the FCC held hearings in the late 40s, after the end of World War II, regarding the topic of what they called news hoaxes or news staging. And so news distortion really needs to be seen on a continuation with that. Was there completely a hoax or falsified event that never even occurred, that was created and meant to mislead the public, almost in like a War of the Worlds? This is totally made up. And then so there was hoaxes, staging, and news distortion. And they held a hearing called Editorializing by Broadcasters in 1948. And they briefly mentioned, this idea of distortion. And then it later became written into some policies of the FCC, but never really pursued until the 70s and 80s, another 30 years later. And then there were some cases about it, documentaries. I made a note here. There was a documentary called Hunger in America, which was a CBS documentary. And there was some misleading editing of B-roll of babies that were preemies and subject to possibly dying because they were premature. And they made it seem like they were dying because they were starving. So that is misleading. But they also found that that was just, basic news broadcasting practices, and there wasn't an attempt to deliberately lie. So news distortion cases, you have to separate what is like a hoax and what is a distortion. And even within the distortion cases, it has to be extrinsic evidence that they lied, because the only justification of that policy is that they're acting in the public interest. And this policy only applies to broadcast. And so it was not found to be a news distortion to misuse the B-roll in that way. The CBS story called Hunger in America. And then there was a later story also by CBS. I think that one was actually 60 Minutes. Yeah, Selling of the Pentagon. In that case, they had spliced together questions and answers. And the commission said, it's just not our job to be the arbiter of truth. As long as it's reasonably accurate, that's not news distortion. And then there was a lawsuit in the late, I think 1999, where a court actually reviewed the Federal Communications Commission and said, look, news distortion requires extrinsic evidence. So it has to be not just someone claiming bias, but it has to be actual evidence that the news management either took a bribe to cover the story in a certain way, or intentionally staged or hoaxed something, or that they instructed the editors to purposely be misleading. So political bias or slant has never been the grounds for a news distortion case. And even in that case, they said, we're sending it back to the commission to look at this further.
Okay, and then so at the beginning of the show, I showed a couple of the clips, the edited and unedited versions of what Kamala Harris said in that Vice President Kamala Harris said in that interview with 60 Minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And, at least my take was they didn't really change what she said to make her answer different. I do think the version that aired showed a much more focused and articulate answer than the ones they edited out. My understanding of that is, that's typical television practice. That's less about making Harris look good and more about having short, succinct answers that audiences can follow so they don't tune out. One, I don't know. Do you agree with my analysis? And two, is there anything you see in that editing you think could even rise to being questionable, legally speaking?
No, I mean, I completely agree with your analysis. It's the job of the broadcaster to tell an accurate story, but it doesn't have to be perfect, and they don't have to we don't even want them to just do the raw transcripts. They're supposed to put it together in a way that's understandable for the public. That's their job. And as it said in the complaint, in the Trump versus CBS complaint that was filed October 24, their main argument was that Kamala Harris had said things that amounted to word salad that were kind of confusing and rambling, and they made her sound better. And that's okay. She said what she said. They didn't misrepresent her position or her answer. It was just an answer from a better expressed one way than another. And that certainly doesn't amount to news distortion under the cases that have occurred.
Yeah, and I think Bernie Sanders. I don't think he addressed it in a clear way, but I sort of interpreted what he was saying in the interview with Rogan similarly to that, because he said, "I've done zillions of interviews, and if I couldn't sue everyone every time, like they've taken out of context, but I also know from doing a lot of television spots and broadcast news, they interview me for 10 minutes, and sometimes I'm kind of thinking out loud, but they take out like a 30-second clip they use, and everyone's like, oh, you're so articulate on the news." So it's part of the it's not necessarily they want me to win an election, right? It's for their broadcast quality.
Right, it's for their broadcast quality. And that's why the commission, in many of these news distortion cases that were brought in the 70s and 80s, in various ways said the commission is not the arbiter of truth. We're never going to get into the thicket of how broadcast is edited. Their editorial judgment is theirs to make. And contrasting with deliberate lying and deliberate falsification. So this complaint by Trump really was bullying. I'm not really surprised that they settled it as they did. I mean, it wasn't a huge amount, $16 million. It's only going to their attorney's fees and the library. Trump's not actually pocketing that money. So I know the free press advocates are opposed to it, but maybe we prevented having a precedent decision made on news distortion that would have been negative to the freedom of the press. I mean, so far, most of the news distortion cases have been very positive to the freedom of the press, and so the First Amendment is going to take, obviously, priority over these news distortion ideas. And in the best case scenario, maybe they would have thrown out news distortion and put it in the trash bin along with the fairness doctrine, but there was no guarantee of that. And I think CBS had business reasons, which they disclaimed, but they had business reasons to get out of the case. It truly was bullying, in my view, though. And to insist or require that CBS release their raw transcripts in the future, I do think that was succumbing to bullying. That really isn't anyone else's paperwork except for theirs.
Can you talk a little bit why you think that's bullying?
Well, I think that CBS gets to have their own judgment about what the news as they want to present it, and why would we require them to release their raw paperwork? Why would we require that of any business? and especially the press, because the press is supposed to be allowed to do their work without fear of censorship. And so I think it would be chilling to like every journalist to think my raw notes are going to be, my transcripts are going to be forced to be made public, when it's, it's an art form. It's not, we're not machines, and they make and build the news using their judgment, and that judgment is given to them by the First Amendment. So I do think requiring them to release the transcripts, as informative as they are, and everyone's not going to look at it, just, those that really love the news. But it did seem to me bullying and unnecessary, because there was no foundation in the case. And there was no extrinsic evidence of deliberate lying, which is what's required for news distortion cases.
Okay. And, something else that came up in that interview, I know I've wrote about it, and we were at an event together, and I heard you talk about this as well. But there's also an important, I think, contextual question to this, right? So it's not just the CBS case. There's the ABC case. He also, he being Donald Trump, also sued the Des Moines Register, which they just dropped that lawsuit a day or two ago. He'd gone after Meta. He'd threatened to remove the licenses for NBC and MSNBC, threatened to remove funding for NPR and PBS. So some people see this as, if you take any one of these cases, they may not seem like that big of a deal, but the totality of them seem like a war on the free press. Someone who studies these issues intimately and has the legal knowledge, I mean, what do you make about that? Is Donald Trump just sort of holding some of these outlets maybe accountable, or do you think it's a much more broad strategy of trying to suppress freedom of the press through fear and intimidation?
Oh, I think there's a frightening trend with this administration to go after the free press, to object to any sort of robust debate, any narrative that he's not in charge of. And, the courts can't take an overall trend as a case. They have to take it case by case. But I think we as observers of the news can see this overall trend. He's not the first president to do it. Nixon did it as well when he went after CBS about their 60 Minutes coverage of the Pentagon in the Nixon administration. So it's not the first president to do it, but like Nixon, he doesn't like the press. He thinks it's the enemy of the people, and that's not democratic. The democratic functioning of the press is that it's a separate and fourth estate, and it operates without government interference. And so the series of cases and increasing violence against journalists is very troubling.
I could talk to you all day, and I think I'm definitely going to have you back on the program, as unfortunately, I think more of these issues will arise. But I want to encourage folks to follow your work. Do you have any places they can go to get to know more about what you do or what you're working on?
Well, you can see me on Google Scholar. I have an article coming out about the participatory industry, about the lack of transparency in social media, that we can't really see what's happening there. So that chapter is not out yet. The book is still being edited, but I'm very interested in distortion within social media, and other articles there about the history of fake news and those things. On this thing, I would also, I know we're almost out of time, but you have to compare the news distortion cases with the defamation cases. Mm-hmm. There's a series of defamation cases where they had this they edited the questions and answers. It looked like that was the answer to this question, but it was edited together. And in fact, in much more deceptive ways. And there's a bunch of cases about that. And in all of those cases, the court said, look, the First Amendment gives editing to the journalist, and we're not going to get in there and try to say where the clip has to go. And so these distortion cases can't really make an end run around the public figure doctrine and the actual malice standards of the defamation cases that still are on the books.
Gosh, thank you so much, Elizabeth Blakey. You're awesome. We appreciate it. Please check out Elizabeth Blakey's work. Thank you, Detoxers.
Okay, see you soon.
Yo, Detoxers, this is the Disinfo Detox. Want to keep media literacy alive and kicking? Chip in at patreon.com/disinfodetox. Broke? We get it. Just like, comment, follow, or share. Even your hate helps the algorithm. Thank you for supporting the Disinfo Detox, where media literacy meets breaking news.